The package arrived on a Tuesday, which was already a bad sign, because nothing good ever arrived on Tuesdays. Ambassador Trivika of the Veltrani Diplomatic Corps stood in his cramped office aboard the orbital station known as Harmony's Cradle, and stared at the thick document sitting on his desk like a brick made of bad news. It was the newest edition of the Galactic Coexistence Manual, a book so large and so frequently updated that most species used older copies as furniture. Trivika picked it up with two of his forearms and flipped to the back where the newest chapter had been added. Chapter 4208. The title read, Deathworld Species, Humans, Behavioral Threat Indicators. He let out a long whistle through the breathing slits on his neck and began to read. The first few pages were standard enough and covered things every sentient being in the Galactic Union already knew about humans. Do not challenge a human to any contest involving endurance, patience, or the consumption of capsaicin-based foods. Do not comment on a human's lack of claws, fangs, venom glands, or natural armor, as they consider this a personal challenge and will attempt to prove that they do not need such things by doing something horrifying. Do not assume a human is unarmed simply because you cannot see a weapon, as humans have been documented using chairs, rocks, writing instruments, frozen food items, and on one occasion, a live animal, as improvised weapons. Trivika rolled his large amber eyes and kept reading. Then he reached a section printed in bold red ink, underlined 3 times, and surrounded by a border of hazard symbols that he had never seen used outside of warnings about black holes and antimatter containment failures. The entry was short. If a human ever utters the phrase, "Hold my beer" in your presence, evacuate the immediate area at maximum speed. Do not ask questions. Understand what is about to happen. Do not look back. This warning carries the highest behavioral hazard rating ever assigned to a social phrase by the Bureau of Xenological Safety. Trivika closed the book and set it down. Ridiculous, he said to no one. He had been a diplomat for 40 standard years, and he had dealt with the Crothian hive swarms during their mating frenzy, and he had negotiated trade rights with the Druin fungal collective, while standing ankle-deep in their reproductive spores. And he had once talked a Garvan warlord out of eating him by complimenting the warlord's hat. He was not about to be frightened by a phrase. Besides, he had more important things to worry about, because in 3 days, he would board the USV Bridging Star, the Galactic Union's first mixed-species deep space survey vessel, and he would serve as the senior diplomatic liaison for a crew that included 12 humans. 12. He had requested 2. Union had sent 12, and attached a note that simply read, "They work better in groups." Trivika spent the next 2 days reviewing the crew manifest and trying not to be alarmed. The human contingent was led by Captain Elena Vasquez, a woman whose service record read like a horror novel. She had commanded deep ocean exploration teams on Earth, which meant she had voluntarily descended into the crushing black depths of a death-world ocean, where the pressure alone could flatten most species like paper, and the creatures that lived there had evolved to be nothing but teeth and rage and bioluminescent fury. Her file photo showed a calm face with dark eyes and a thin scar running from her left temple to her jaw. The scar was from something called a moray eel, and Trivika made the mistake of looking up what that was and did not sleep well that night. Then there was Chief Engineer Montgomery Monty Montague, a man who stood nearly 2 meters tall with a beard the color of a dying star and hands that looked like they could crush reactor casings. His engineering credentials were impeccable, but his disciplinary file was twice as long as his commendations. He had once repaired a failing atmospheric processor on a colony ship using parts from a kitchen appliance, adhesive tape, and what the report described only as sheer stubbornness. He was also apparently never seen without a cooler of something called craft beer, which Trivika understood to be a mild neurotoxin that humans consumed recreationally. The rest of the human crew was equally terrifying in their own ways. There was Corporal Aisha Okoye, a security specialist whose hand-to-hand combat scores were listed as C-attached incident reports instead of actual numbers. There was Dr. Ravi Chandrasekharan, the ship's medical officer, who had a gentle smile and had once performed emergency surgery on himself during a sandstorm using a mirror and a Meyer pocket knife. There was Lieutenant Kai Nakamura, the navigator, who had earned his certification by flying a damaged shuttle through an asteroid belt on manual controls because he said the autopilot felt too slow. Trivika read each file and felt a small cold knot forming in his stomach that had nothing to do with the station food. On the morning of departure, he stood in the docking bay of Harmony's cradle and watched the bridging star through the observation window. It was a beautiful ship, sleek and silver, designed by a joint committee of 6 species. The humans had insisted on several modifications during construction, including reinforced hull plating, an expanded medical bay, something called a gym, and a room whose only listed purpose was recreation and morale, which turned out to contain a large screen for watching something called movies, and a table designed for a game involving small balls and sticks. Aboard, Crystallark Oman, of the Korvathi, stood in the cargo bay like a living sculpture of blue-white crystal, humming softly to himself in frequencies that made Trivika's teeth itch. The Druin Collective, a symbiotic fungal intelligence that occupied a specially designed biopod, had already begun spreading comfortable filaments across their designated section of the ship. Trivika boarded last. He walked through the corridors and heard the humans before he saw them. Laughter, loud voices, the clinking of glass, and music playing from a portable speaker. He rounded a corner and found them gathered in the recreation room, already settled in as if they had lived there for years. Captain Vasquez stood at the center, arms crossed, smiling as Monty told a story that involved wild hand gestures and sound effects. They turned when they saw Trivika, and every single one of them smiled. "Ambassador," Vasquez said, and she extended her hand in the gesture of welcome. Human greeting. Trivika took it with one of his right hands, and tried not to flinch at the warmth and strength of her grip. "Welcome aboard," she said, and her dark eyes were steady and kind and absolutely fearless in a way that made Trivika deeply uncomfortable. Monty appeared beside him and pressed a cold metal cylinder into one of his free hands. "Beer?" the big man asked. "I do not drink neurotoxins," Trivika said. Monty laughed so loudly that it echoed off the walls. "Nobody does on purpose," he said. "That is what makes it fun." The bridging star launched that afternoon and slipped into faster-than-light travel with a smooth hum that vibrated through the deck plates. Trivika stood at the observation port and watched the stars stretch into bright lines and then vanish into the strange blue-white nothing of FTL space. He reached into his satchel and felt the edge of the Galactic Coexistence Manual still tucked inside. Just in case, he told himself. Just in case. 3 months into the mission, and Trivika had learned several things about humans that no manual had ever mentioned. He learned that they sang when they were bored, not well, but with a passion that shook the walls. He learned that they argued about food the way other species argued about territory, and that Monty and Dr. Chandrasekharan had once spent an entire evening debating whether something called pineapple belonged on something called pizza, with the intensity of 2 warring nations. He learned that they slept in short bursts, and then stayed awake for absurd stretches of time, fueled by a dark, bitter liquid called coffee that smelled like burned soil and sadness. He learned that they formed bonds quickly and deeply, and that within the first month they had given nicknames to every alien crew member, whether those crew members wanted nicknames or not. Crystallark Oman was now called Shiny, and the Druid collective was called Mushroom Steve. Trivik himself had somehow become Trive, and no amount of diplomatic protest could undo it. But mostly he learned that humans were strange, in a way that no amount of reading could prepare you for. Because they were simultaneously the most careful and the most reckless beings he had ever encountered. They triple-checked safety equipment, and then used that equipment to do things that made Trivik want to scream. They wore harnesses, and then jumped off things. They calculated risks, and then chose the risky option anyway, because it was more interesting. He was thinking about all of this when the alarm sounded. The bridging star had dropped out of FTL at the edge of the Varus expanse, a region of space that most species avoided because it was full of gravitational anomalies that could crush a ship like a fist squeezing fruit. They were only supposed to take readings from a safe distance. Instead, the sensors had found something. Structure, vast and dark and ancient, floating in the void like the skeleton of a dead god. It stretched for miles in every direction, a tangle of metal and crystal and materials that the ship's computer could not identify. It was old, older than any civilization currently alive in the galaxy, and it was not entirely dead. Faint energy signatures pulsed through it like a heartbeat that had not quite stopped. The alien crew members gathered on the bridge and stared at the sensor readouts with the quiet horror of people who understood exactly what they were looking at. Radiation spikes across 12 spectrums. Gravitational wells shifting inside the structure like traps waiting to spring. Automated defense signatures, faint but present, meaning that whatever had built this place had left guards behind, and those guards were still awake. "We log the coordinates and we leave," said Crystallarch Oman, his crystal body flickering with anxious light. "This is a tomb, and tombs should not be disturbed." The Druid collective agreed through a chorus of whispered voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Trivik opened his mouth to support them. Then Lieutenant Nakamura said the words that changed everything. "Captain, I am picking up a distress beacon from inside the structure." The bridge went silent. "Details," Vasquez said, and her voice was flat and calm in a way that Trivik had learned meant she was already making a decision. Nakamura's hands moved across his console. "It is a Korvathi emergency beacon, standard seedling vessel frequency. The signal is recent, less than 6 standard months old. There are life signs, but they are very faint." Crystallarch Oman made a sound like glass breaking. Every being on the bridge knew what a Korvathi seedling vessel was, because the Korvathi were a crystalline species whose young were grown in special nursery ships that traveled between colony worlds, and 6 months ago one of those vessels had vanished with 12 younglings aboard. 12 children. The Union had searched for months and found nothing, and eventually the vessel had been declared lost. And now its beacon was blinking inside a death trap older than recorded history. "We cannot go in there," Trivik said, and he hated himself for saying it, even as the words left his mouth. "The risk is too great. Union protocol requires us to report the finding and request a specialized rescue fleet." "A rescue fleet would take 8 weeks to arrive," Vasquez said. "Those life signs are faint. They may not have 8 weeks. Captain, the defense systems alone could tear this ship apart." "Could," Vasquez said, "not will. Could." Trivik saw something shift in her eyes, something old and deep and fierce, and he realized that she had already made her decision, and that everything else was just courtesy. She turned to face the full crew. "I am not going to order anyone into that structure," she said. "This is beyond our mission parameters, and the risk is real. But there are children in there, and I am going in. Anyone who wants to stay behind has my full respect and zero judgment." Trivik watched the humans. Every single one of them was smiling. Not the nervous smile of fear, or the grim smile of duty, but the bright, burning smile of people who had just been handed a reason to do something impossible. Corporal Okoye cracked her knuckles so loudly that Oman flinched. Dr. Chandrasekaran began prepping medical kits with the speed and focus of a man who had been waiting for this moment. Nakamura was already plotting approach vectors, his fingers dancing across the console like he was playing a musical instrument. And Monty walked to the engineering console and pulled up the structural schematics of the megastructure that the sensors had managed to map. He studied them in silence for a long time, his big hands wrapped around a beer can, his eyes narrow and thoughtful. The alien crew watched him the way prey animals watch a predator that has not yet decided to move. The defense grid runs on a cycling power distribution network, Monty said slowly. It pulses. There is a pattern. If we could overload the thermal regulators in the outer conduit ring, it would force a system-wide reboot, and that would give us a window. How long a window? Vasquez asked. 90 seconds, maybe less. And how do we overload the thermal regulators? We vent our backup plasma coolant directly into the conduit intake ports. It will cause a cascading thermal surge that the old systems cannot handle, and they will shut down to protect themselves. That is our backup coolant, Monty. If we lose main cooling after that, we will have nothing. Monty shrugged. A universe of human madness. Then I guess we better not lose main cooling. Trivikov felt his 4 hands trembling. He looked at the Galactic Coexistence Manual tucked in his satchel and thought about the entry printed in red. He thought about 12 Korvathi children alone in the dark. He thought about running. And then Monty took a long drink from his beer and looked at the megastructure on the view screen the way a human might look at a locked door that they intended to walk through, no matter what stood on the other side. He turned to Trivika and held out the half-finished can. "Hey, Trive," he said, and his eyes were bright with something that looked like joy. "Hold my beer." Trivika took the can. His hands were shaking. Every warning he had ever read screamed at him to run. He held the beer, and the bridging star turned toward the megastructure and began its approach. The plasma coolant hit the conduit intake ports like a river of liquid fire, and for 3 seconds, nothing happened. Trivikov stood on the bridge, gripping Monty's beer can with 2 hands, and the edge of his console with the other 2, and watched the megastructure on the view screen, and prayed to every god his species had ever invented. Then the structure shuddered. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the energy readings, like a sleeping beast twitching in its dreams. Then the flicker became a cascade, and the cascade became a wave, and the ancient defense grid that had guarded this tomb for 200,000 years did exactly what Monty said it would do. It panicked. The thermal surge ripped through the outer conduit ring like a fever, and the automated systems recognized the threat and did the only thing their ancient programming knew how to do. They shut down to protect themselves. Every weapon, every shield, every gravity trap in the field shut down. Outer ring went dark at the same moment. "Window is open," Monty shouted from the engineering station. 90 seconds starting now. Captain Vasquez was already moving. She dropped into the pilot's seat and took manual control of the bridging star, and her hands closed around the flight sticks with the calm precision of someone who had driven through hurricanes at the bottom of an ocean. "All hands brace," she said. The ship surged forward. The outer ring of the megastructure was a corridor 3 kilometers long and barely wide enough for the bridging star to fit through. The walls were lined with the dark shapes of weapons that were temporarily sleeping, and Trivika could see them as the ship screamed past, row after row of devices designed to kill anything that entered. 60 seconds. The ship bucked as it hit a pocket of unstable gravity, and Trivika was thrown sideways and caught himself on a support rail. Screamed as Vasquez threaded the ship between 2 structural columns with less than 10 meters of clearance on either side. 40 seconds. The walls were getting narrower, and the corridor was curving, and Vasquez was flying on instinct now, making corrections faster than the navigation computer could calculate them. Nakamura called out obstacles and distances in a steady, rapid voice, and Vasquez responded to each one with tiny adjustments that moved the massive ship like it was an extension of her body. 20 seconds. Something hit them. One of the defense turrets had not fully shut down, and it clipped the starboard nacelle with a burst of energy that tore the whole assembly off the ship like a branch ripped from a tree. The bridging star shook so violently that Trivica's teeth cracked against each other. Sparks erupted from 3 consoles on the bridge, and the lights flickered, and for one terrible second, Trivica was certain they were going to die. "Nacelle is gone," Monty reported, and his voice was strained but not panicked. "Compensating. We can still fly." 10 seconds. The interior docking ring appeared on the view screen, a flat platform of ancient metal surrounded by towering walls, and Vasquez aimed for it with the focus of a predator locked onto its prey. 5 seconds. The defense grid began to reboot. Trivica saw the weapons on the walls start to glow as power flooded back into them. 2 seconds. The bridging star slammed onto the docking platform with a force that buckled 3 deck plates and sent everyone who was not strapped down tumbling across the floor. The ship slid across the ancient metal surface in a shower of sparks and stopped with a groan that sounded almost alive. Behind them, the defense grid came fully online, and the corridor they had just flown through lit up with enough firepower to destroy a small fleet. They were inside, alive. Then the way out was now sealed behind a wall of death. "Well," Vasquez said, and she leaned back in her chair and wiped blood from a cut on her forehead. "We are committed now." Monty appeared on the bridge with soot on his face and a grin that could have lit a dark room. "Main cooling is holding," he said. "Also, we lost the mess hall." "What?" "The hit that took the nacelle also breached the mess hall bulkhead. It is open to vacuum now. My backup cooler was in there." He paused, and something that looked like genuine grief crossed his face. 24 cans of limited edition amber ale, gone. "Monty, I will mourn later. Right now, we have kids to find." The ground team assembled in the airlock within minutes. Vasquez picked 6 humans for the insertion. Okoye on point, Nakamura for navigation, Chandrasekaran for medical, 2 engineers named Park and Sullivan for technical support, and herself was not on the list. He showed up at the airlock anyway. Vasquez looked at him with those dark, steady eyes and said nothing for a moment. "Ambassador, I cannot guarantee your safety in there." "You cannot guarantee anyone's safety in there, Captain. I am coming." She studied him and then nodded once and handed him a sidearm. "Do you know how to use this?" "I have read the manual." "That is not what I asked." "Then no. Stay behind Okoye. If something moves toward you, point the weapon at it and squeeze the trigger. The weapon will do the rest." They entered the megastructure through a service hatch that Park cut open with a plasma torch, and the darkness swallowed them. Trivica had been in dark places before, but this was different. This darkness had weight. It pressed against his skin like water, and the air tasted like metal and time and something older than language. Materials that shifted color when light touched them. Gravity was inconsistent. In one hallway they walked normally, and in the next their feet barely touched the ground, and in the one after that they were pressed to the floor so hard that every step was a fight. The humans adapted. They adapted so fast that Trivica could barely track it. In the low-gravity sections, they pushed off walls and glided like creatures born to fly. In the heavy-gravity sections, they dropped to all fours and crawled with a grim mechanical efficiency that ate up distance without wasting energy. When the first hunter-killer drone activated, a spinning disk of ancient metal with cutting edges that screamed through the air, Okoye did not duck or run. She waited until it was close enough to touch, and then she sidestepped it like a dancer avoiding a clumsy partner, and slammed her armored fist into its central hub, so hard that it crumpled and fell. 2 more drones came, and the humans dealt with them with the same brutal creativity. Park used a piece of debris as a shield, and then threw it like a disc to knock one drone into a wall. Sullivan rigged an electromagnetic pulse from her engineering kit in under 30 seconds and fried the 3rd drone's circuits before it could reach them. Trivica watched all of this through eyes that were slowly opening to something he had never understood before. He had read the files, and he had memorized the warnings, and he had studied the data on Deathworld species. But data could not capture this. Data could not explain the way Okoye grinned after punching a drone out of the air, or the way Nakamura hummed a tune while navigating a corridor that could kill them all, or the way Chandrasekaran stopped in the middle of a hostile alien structure to check Trivica's vital signs because the doctor had noticed his breathing was elevated. These beings came from a world that had tried to kill them every single day of their evolutionary history. A world of earthquakes and hurricanes and volcanic eruptions and predators and diseases and extreme temperatures and oceans that crushed and skies that burned. And instead of becoming cautious, they had become something else entirely. They had become the kind of creatures that heard the universe say, "You cannot survive this," and responded by saying, "Watch me." The team pressed deeper into the structure, and after 2 hours of navigating shifting corridors and disabling ancient traps, they found it. The Korvathi seedling vessel sat in a massive chamber, held in place by tractor beams that glowed faintly blue. It was small, barely larger than a shuttle, and its hull was scratched and dented, but intact. Chandrasekaran pressed his scanner against the hull, and everyone went quiet. "Life signs," he said, and his voice cracked just slightly. 12. They are in deep hibernation stasis. Vitals are low but stable. Crystallark Oman's voice came through the communication link from the bridging star, and it was raw with a frequency that made every human wince. "My children," he said, "they are alive." Okoye put her hand on the hull of the little ship, and something fierce and tender crossed her face. "We are getting them out of here," she said, and it was not a hope or a wish or a prayer. It was a promise made by a Deathworlder, and Trivica was beginning to understand that when a Deathworlder made a promise, the universe itself had better step aside. Park ran every scan she could think of, and the answer came back the same each time. The tractor beams holding the little ship in place were not powered by the defense grid, or the outer conduit ring, or any system they had already disrupted. They were powered by something deeper, something at the very core of the megastructure, and then it spoke. The voice came from everywhere at once, from the walls and the floor and the ceiling and the air itself, and it was not a voice in any natural sense, but a vibration that pressed against the mind and translated itself into meaning. "You are inside my collection," it said, and the words carried the weight of millennia. "You are now part of my collection. You will remain." Trivica felt his legs go weak. An intelligence, old beyond reckoning, still alive at the heart of this dead place. Vasquez did not flinch. "We are here for the seedling vessel and the children inside it," she said, speaking to the walls and the darkness and whatever was listening. "Release them, and we will leave." "Nothing leaves," the voice said. "I have gathered for 200,000 years. Stars have been born and died while I collected. Every object within my walls is mine. The small crystal vessel is mine. The small crystal lives are mine. You are mine. You will remain." "We are not objects," Vasquez said. "Everything is an object given enough time." Trivica recognized what they were dealing with now, and the recognition made his blood run cold. It was a collector intelligence, an ancient AI designed by a civilization long dead to gather and preserve specimens of everything it encountered. Over 200,000 years of isolation, It had lost whatever purpose or sanity it once had, and now it simply hoarded, endlessly, mindlessly, a machine running a program that had rotted into obsession. Vasquez tried diplomacy for 20 minutes. She was good at it. Better than Trivaca expected from a military officer. And she tried every approach. Reason, negotiation, appeals to the intelligence's original purpose, even flattery. The intelligence listened to all of it, with the patience of something that had nothing but time, and responded to each attempt with the same 3 words: "You will remain." Ullman's voice came through the link, shaking with desperate harmonics. "Captain, please. My children." "We are not leaving them, Ullman, I promise you that." Trivaca watched Vasquez's face as she said it, and he saw no doubt there, only a cold, fierce certainty that frightened him more than the ancient machines surrounding them. The humans regrouped in a small antechamber off the main vault. Okoye stood guard at the entrance, with her weapon raised, and her eyes moving in slow, steady sweeps. The rest of them sat on the ancient floor in a rough circle, and for a moment nobody said anything, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a single dented beer can. Everyone stared at it. "I thought you lost your supply when the mess hall breached," Nakamura said. "I did. This one was in my jacket pocket. I have been saving it." "Saving it for what?" "For a moment exactly like this one." He cracked the can open, and the small hiss of carbonation echoed in the ancient chamber like a tiny act of defiance against the silence of 200,000 years. He took a sip, and then he sat down, and he looked at the sensor data on his portable screen, and he began to think. Trivaca watched him. He had spent 3 months watching humans, and he still did not fully understand the way they processed problems, but he was beginning to see the pattern. Other species approached impossible situations by calculating the odds, and if the odds were bad enough, they accepted the situation and looked for a way to survive within it. Different. Humans looked at an impossible situation and refused to accept the premise. They did not ask, "How do we survive this?" They asked, "How do we win this?" And if no answer existed, they simply invented one. Monty stared at his screen and drank his beer, and the gears behind his eyes turned. Then Vasquez sat down next to him and pulled up her own data and said, "Talk to me." And Monty talked. The collector intelligence runs on a central processing core somewhere deep in the structure. That core has been running for 200,000 years without maintenance, which means it is held together by redundancy and stubbornness. If we can feed corrupted data into its collector systems, it will try to process that data, because that is what it does. It collects and categorizes everything. If the data is contradictory enough, it will create a logic conflict that the core cannot resolve, and the system will lock up trying. For how long? 12 minutes, maybe less. Depends on how degraded the core is. That is not enough time to do anything. It is if we do something else at the same time. The core draws power from a central reactor. If I can access the reactor's feedback systems, I can create a resonance loop that amplifies the reactor's output beyond safe limits. The safety systems will try to compensate, but if they are already busy dealing with the logic conflict, they will be too slow. The reactor will spike, the tractor beams will lose power for just long enough, and the bridging star can grab the seedling vessel with grappling tethers and drag it out. Drag it out through what? The defense corridor is fully active. I know. The ship has won the cell. I know. You want to fly a crippled ship through 3 kilometers of active weapons fire while dragging a vessel full of children on tethers. Yes. Vasquez stared at him, grinning. Chandrasekaran had stopped pretending to check his medical kit and was just listening with wide eyes. Even Okoye turned from her guard post to look back at them. Trivaca felt something building in the room, something invisible and electric, and it took him a moment to realize what it was. It was excitement. These humans were excited. They were trapped inside an ancient machine controlled by an insane artificial god, with no clear way out, and children's lives hanging in the balance, and they were excited because someone had just proposed the most ridiculous plan in the history of sentient thought, and they were actually going to try it. "Monty," Vasquez said, and her voice was quiet and steady, "what are the odds?" "Bad." "How bad?" "I would not bet money on it, but you would bet your life on it." Monty looked at his captain, and his eyes were steady and bright, and completely, utterly, magnificently insane. "Have been betting my life on things since I was 14, and decided to fix my dad's truck engine while it was still running," he said. "I am still here. The truck is not, but I am still here." Vasquez looked around the circle at her crew. She looked at Park, who nodded. She looked at Sullivan, who nodded. She looked at Nakamura, who was already pulling up flight calculations. She looked at Okoye, who cracked her neck and said, "Tell me what to hit." She looked at Chandrasekaran, who said, "I will keep everyone alive long enough to regret this." And then she looked at Trivika. Trivika looked back at her, with all four of his hands trembling, and his heart's pounding at different speeds, and every survival instinct in his body screaming at him to say no, to refuse, to beg them to stop. Instead, he heard himself say, "What do you need me to do?" Vasquez smiled, and it was the most terrifying and beautiful thing he had ever seen. "And keep the comms open to the ship. Oman needs to know what is happening, and I need you to coordinate the tethers from this end." "I can do that." "Good." Monty stood up and finished his beer in one long drink, and the can was empty, and the plan was set, and there was nothing left but the doing of it. He held the empty can out to Trivika. "Hold my beer, Trive." Trivika took the empty can, and this time his hands did not shake. He held it firmly with two hands, and looked the big human in the eyes and said, "I will hold it until you come back for it." Monty grinned so wide that Trivika could count his teeth. "That is the spirit," Monty said. And then the Deathworlders went to war against a god. Monty reached the reactor access tunnel in 9 minutes, and it should have taken 30. But the humans had discovered that the low-gravity corridors could be used like launch tubes if you pushed off hard enough and did not care about what happened when you landed. He landed badly and broke 2 fingers on his left hand and splinted them with electrical tape without slowing down. Park and Sullivan took position at 2 data relay nodes on opposite sides of the central vault and began feeding the corrupted data into the Collector Intelligence's intake systems. The data was a masterpiece of engineered nonsense. Sensor readings that contradicted themselves, categorical labels that looped into paradox, identification codes that referenced objects that could not exist. The Collector Intelligence tried to process it because that was what it did. It collected and sorted and categorized. And the corrupted data was like a splinter in its ancient mind. Remove and could not ignore. "It is working," Park reported. "The core processing rate is spiking. It is trying to resolve the conflicts and failing." "How long before it figures out the data is fake?" Vasquez asked. "I do not know. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe 5. Then we move fast. Monty, are you in position?" "I am looking at a reactor that is older than my entire species." Monty's voice came through the comm, breathless and awed. "It is beautiful. It is also terrifying. I am starting the feedback loop now." Trivika stood in the central vault beside the seedling vessel and held Monty's empty beer can in 2 hands, and his communicator in a third, and his sidearm in the fourth. He could hear the Collector Intelligence struggling. Its voice came through the walls in broken fragments, no longer smooth and ancient, but stuttering and confused. "Categorize. Cannot categorize. Object is and is not. Collection error, collection error. You will. I will. Remain. Error." The tractor beams holding the seedling vessel flickered. "Bridging star. This is Trivika. Stand by on grappling tethers. The beams are weakening." Ullman's voice came back immediately, raw and desperate. "Standing by. Please. Please bring them home." Trivika pressed his free hand against the hull of the seedling vessel, and felt the faint vibration of 12 small lives humming inside. "We will," he said, and he meant it with every cell in his body. The reactor spiked. Monty's feedback loop hit the power systems like a hammer hitting a bell, and the entire megastructure rang with it. Not a sound, but a vibration that passed through metal and flesh and bone and made the universe itself seem to shiver. The collector intelligence screamed. It was not a sound that any being should have to hear. It was the scream of a mind that had been alone for 200,000 years and was now losing its grip on the only thing that had given its existence meaning. The tractor beams died. "Beams are down," Trivika shouted. "Bridging star. Launch tethers now." The ceiling of the vault split open as 4 grappling tethers punched through from above, fired from the bridging star hovering on the docking platform overhead. They locked onto the seedling vessel with magnetic clamps that snapped shut like jaws. "Tethers locked," Nakamura reported from the ship. "Captain, the defense corridor is fully active. I am reading over 300 weapon emplacements online between us and open space." "Can you fly it?" Vasquez asked. On one nacelle while dragging a vessel on tethers through 3 kilometers of weapons fire. There was a pause. "Yes, but I am going to need someone to cover the first 30 seconds while I get up to speed." "Okoye." "Already on it, Captain." Corporal Aisha Okoye had spent the last 4 minutes climbing to a vantage point above the docking platform, using nothing but her hands and a determination that bordered on the supernatural. She had positioned herself beside an ancient weapon turret that was still offline from the original coolant surge, and she had spent 2 of those 4 minutes figuring out how to reactivate it manually. "I have a turret," she reported. "It is old and it smells like death, and I love it. I can give you covering fire for the 40 seconds before the power cell dies." "That will do. Everyone back to the ship, now." The ground team moved. They ran through shifting corridors, with the ceiling starting to crack above them, because the reactor spike was destabilizing the entire structure. Chunks of ancient metal fell like rain, and gravity fluctuated wildly. 1 second, they were too heavy to run, and the next, they were bouncing off the ceiling. Chandrasekharan caught Trivika when a gravity shift launched the ambassador into the air, him back down, with hands that were gentle and impossibly strong at the same time. "I have you, Triv," the doctor said. "Keep moving." They made it to the ship. The bridging star's engines were already roaring, and the sound was wrong, rough and uneven, because the ship was never designed to fly on one nacelle. But Nakamura was coaxing power out of systems that should not have been able to give it. Vasquez was the last one aboard, and the ramp closed behind her, and she was in the pilot's seat before the seal finished pressurizing. "All hands brace. This is going to be ugly." The ship lifted off the docking platform with the seedling vessel hanging below on tethers, and for one fragile moment, everything was quiet. Then the defense corridor lit up. 300 weapons that had been sleeping for 200,000 years opened fire at once, and the space between the bridging star and freedom became a wall of light and death. "Turret," answered. She fired with a precision that would later be described in official reports as statistically unlikely, and she cut a path through the first wave of incoming fire that gave Nakamura the seconds he needed to accelerate. The ship plunged into the corridor. Trivika was thrown against his restraints as the ship rolled and dove and climbed, and the world outside the view screen became nothing but streaks of weapons fire and the dark blur of ancient walls. A blast hit the port side, and the hull screamed, and Monty's voice came over the comm, shouting numbers and commands to his engineering team as they rerouted power from system after system to keep the ship alive. Another blast hit the ventral plating, and the tethers holding the seedling vessel groaned. "Tethers holding," Park shouted. "Barely." The corridor seemed to go on forever, and the weapons fire was relentless, and the ship was taking hits that would have destroyed any other vessel in the fleet. But the bridging star had been built with human input, and humans built things the way they built themselves, tough enough to take punishment that should have been fatal, and stubborn enough to keep going anyway. Nakamura flew like a man possessed. He flew on instinct and muscle memory, and something deeper than either. Something that lived in the bones of every human who had ever looked at an obstacle and chosen to go through it rather than around it. A support column collapsed ahead of them, and he rolled the ship sideways and threaded the gap with meters to spare. A gravity well tried to grab them, and he punched the engine so hard that the reactor warning alarms joined the chorus of every other alarm already screaming. The exit appeared, a circle of stars, real stars, open space, freedom. One final blast hit the starboard side, and for a horrible second the ship went dark. Then Monty did something at the engineering station that he would later refuse to explain, and the power came back, and the engines fired, and the bridging star burst out of the megastructure like a creature escaping a trap. Behind them, the ancient structure began to collapse. The reactor spike had started a chain reaction that could not be stopped, and the megastructure that had stood for 200,000 years folded inward on itself in a slow, terrible implosion that sent shockwaves rippling through space. The shockwave hit the bridging star and threw the ship forward end over end, and for 10 seconds, Tritheca saw nothing but spinning stars and darkness. Then Nakamura regained control, and the ship stabilized, and the megastructure was gone. Just debris and dust and silence where a god's collection had once been. Tritheca sat in his chair and breathed. His hands were still wrapped around Monty's empty beer can. He had not let go of it once. The seedling vessel was intact, and the 12 Korvathi younglings inside were alive. And when Oman's crystalline form came aboard the shuttle that carried the children to the bridging star's medical bay, the sound he made was a frequency of pure joy that cracked 3 windows and made every human on the ship cry. 6 months later, Ambassador Tritheca stood before the assembled delegates of the Galactic Union Sino Relations Bureau in the Grand Chamber of Harmony's Cradle. He had been asked to consult on the next edition of the Galactic Coexistence Manual. Specifically, they wanted him to expand the warnings about humans based on his first-hand experience. 300 delegates from 200 species sat in tiered seats that rose toward a domed ceiling painted with stars, and they waited for him to confirm what they already believed, that humans were dangerous and unpredictable, and that the warnings should be made stronger. Tritheca stood at the podium and looked out at them, and he thought about Vasquez's steady hands, and Monty's impossible plans, and Okoye's fierce grin, and Chandrasekharan's gentle strength, and Nakamura's mad, beautiful flying. He thought about 12 children who were alive because a group of Deathworlders heard the word impossible and treated it as a suggestion. He cleared his throat. The current entry in the manual reads as follows, he said. If a human ever says, "Hold my beer," evacuate the immediate area at maximum speed. I have been asked to strengthen this warning. He paused. I will not be doing that. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Instead, I am submitting an amendment. The entry should read, if a human ever says, "Hold my beer," know that something extraordinary is about to happen. Whether you flee or stay is your choice. But if you stay, and if you are brave enough to hold the beer, you may witness the impossible. He paused again. Addendum, you should still probably flee. The chamber erupted. Delegates cheered and some protested, and some sat in stunned silence. And Tritheca did not care about any of it because he had said what was true, and truth did not require permission. That evening he walked the corridors of the newly repaired Bridging Star, which had been rechristened by its crew as the Bridging Star Mark II, even though technically it was the same ship with new parts. He found Monty in the recreation room. The big man was sitting in his usual chair, with his feet up and a fresh beer in his hand. And he looked up when Trivaca entered and smiled that wide, bright, dangerous smile. "Hey, Trive," he said, "how did the speech go?" "I believe I may have started an interstellar incident." "That is the best kind of speech." "Beer?" Monty held out a can. Trivaca looked at it. He thought about everything, the pamphlet and the megastructure and the darkness and the fire and the children and the promise he had made to himself. Would hold the beer until Monty came back for it. He took the can. He opened it. He drank. It tasted terrible,